Imagine standing in the Sudanese desert surrounded by more than 200 steep, narrow pyramids rising from the sand and almost no one around you. No tour buses, no gift shops, no crowds pressing in from every side, just the wind, the heat, and the silence of a civilization that once ruled the greatest empire on earth. These are the pyramids of Meroe, and almost no one in the modern world knows they exist. This is the story of a kingdom that conquered Egypt itself, a kingdom of dark-skinned Nubian pharaohs who wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, who built more pyramids than the Egyptians ever did, who held off the Roman Empire and negotiated as equals with Augustus Caesar, a kingdom whose queens led armies into battle, a kingdom with its own writing system, one we still cannot fully read, and then somehow a kingdom that vanished so completely from the pages of history that for centuries the world simply forgot it had existed. How does an empire of that magnitude disappear from memory? Why do we know the names of Egyptian pharaohs but not the Nubian rulers who came to govern them? And what does that forgetting tell us about which stories we choose to tell and which ones we let the desert swallow? This is the kingdom of Kush. To understand how a Nubian kingdom came to rule Egypt and why it then vanished from memory, we have to travel back to a place the ancient Egyptians both
South
feared
along the
and
Nile
coveted.
they marched,
They called
the
it
might of
Ta-Seti,
Egypt displayed for
land
the
of
lords
bow,
of Nubia,
a
watching
land that
from the
sat to
cliffs
the
above.
south beyond the first cataract of the Nile in the region we now know as Sudan. The Nile in this stretch does not flow peacefully. Between Aswan in the north and Khartoum in the south, the river breaks across 6 major cataracts, churning rapids of granite boulders and white water that made navigation treacherous and military invasion extraordinarily difficult. These cataracts were not merely obstacles, they were walls, natural fortifications that defined the edges of civilizations. Egypt lay to the north of the first cataract. Beyond it, stretching southward for over 1,000 kilometers, lay Nubia, a land of extraordinary richness, gold, ivory, ebony, incense, exotic animals, and human skill. And within that land, a civilization was beginning to stir. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, roughly 1,000 years before Moses, 1,500 years before the Trojan War, a city was rising at the third cataract of the Nile, the city of Kerma. Archaeologists have found it largely intact beneath the Sudanese desert, and what they found there astonished them. This was
The
not a
victory
settlement
stele of
nomads
Pi
or a rough
commemorates the
trading post.
Kushite king's
Kerma was a
conquest of Egypt,
sophisticated urban center,
uniting the
a
two
city with
lands under
planned
his
streets,
rule.
large mud brick buildings, an industrial quarter for craft production, and at its heart a great ceremonial structure the Nubians called the Defufa. The western Defufa still stands today, 18 meters tall, its thick mud brick walls absorbing the desert sun the same way they did when it was built 4,500 years ago. Inside its passages and chambers, archaeologists have found the remnants of painted decoration, religious ritual, and deliberate, careful planning. This was a capital city, the heart of the Kerma culture, a civilization that flourished from approximately 2,500 to 1,500 years before the Common Era. The Kerma culture was not a primitive society living in Egypt's shadow. At its height, around 1,700 years before the Common Era, the Kingdom of Kerma was arguably the most powerful state in the Nile Valley, equal to and sometimes rival of Egypt itself. The cemetery at Kerma contains more than 30,000 graves beneath great earthen mounds stretching up to 90 meters in
Hear
diameter
my
lie
prayer,
the
great
rulers of this
Ra.
kingdom,
May your light
and
shine
around them
upon the
evidence
black
of
land
something
and
extraordinary and
protect my
deeply
people.
unsettling. Hundreds of sacrificed humans buried alongside each king. Some of the royal burial mounds contain the remains of as many as 400 individuals killed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. This was a society of immense complexity and power, one that traded with Egypt, fought with Egypt, and sometimes allied with Egypt's enemies. The Egyptians named this land Kush, possibly from the indigenous word kasu, and they watched it with a mixture of admiration and dread. But in the 16th century before the Common Era, everything changed. The Egyptian New Kingdom, one of the most militarily aggressive eras in pharaonic history, pushed southward. Pharaoh Thutmose I penetrated deep into Nubia, and over the following centuries, Egypt conquered and absorbed the entire Kerma kingdom. What happened next is one of the most fascinating chapters in ancient history. The Kushites did not resist Egyptian culture, they embraced it. The Nubian elite adopted Egyptian gods, Egyptian dress, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Egyptian administrative practices. But scholars note something crucial. The Nubian masses, the common people, retained their own language, their own customs, and their own identity. The conquerors thought they were absorbing Kush. In reality, the encounter was far more mutual and far more dangerous for Egypt than anyone could have anticipated, because the Kushites were not merely learning from Egypt, they were studying it, memorizing it, waiting. For 400 years, the Egyptians controlled Nubia through a royal governor they called the Viceroy of Kush, based at Kerma. They built temples here. They extracted gold here, enough gold to make Egypt the wealthiest nation on earth. They stationed soldiers and administrators and priests, and during those 4 centuries, the Nubian elite absorbed everything Egypt had to offer: its religion, its architecture, its cosmology, its language of power. Then Egypt stumbled. The New Kingdom collapsed around 1069 years before the Common Era, beginning what Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period, an era of political fragmentation, rival dynasties, and weakening central power. To the south, the Nubians were watching, and the kingdom that emerged from Kerma's ashes had a new capital, a new name, and a burning ambition. The capital was Napata. The ambition was to rule the world. Napata. The very name carries weight. This city sat beside a dramatic flat-top mountain the Egyptians themselves had declared sacred, Jebel Barkal, the pure mountain. They believed that inside this mesa Amen himself dwelled, and they built a great temple at its base. When the Egyptians withdrew, they left the temple behind, and the Kushite rulers who rose to power at Napata seized on this inheritance with extraordinary political intelligence. If Amen lived in this mountain, if the god himself sanctified this place, then the rulers of Napata were not merely kings, they were the true protectors of Amen, the rightful heirs to the divine order the Egyptians had built and then abandoned. It was a stroke of religious genius, and it would take them all the way to Memphis. By the 8th century before the Common Era, a king named Kashta had begun to extend Kushite influence northward into Egypt. He was the first Kushite ruler to use Egyptian royal titles, but it was his son, Piye, also known by the Greek form of his name, Pianki, who would accomplish something that seemed almost impossible: the conquest of all Egypt. Piye left behind a monument that tells his story in extraordinary detail. The Victory Stele of Piye, a slab of dark granite nearly 2 meters tall, discovered at Jebel Barkal in 1862, and now in the Cairo Museum, records 159 lines of inscription describing his campaign north. It is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world. What makes it remarkable is not just the military victory it describes, it is the portrait it paints of Piye himself, deeply religious, meticulous, wrathful when princes failed to prepare their horses properly, and utterly convinced that his campaign was the will of Amun. In approximately 727 years before the Common Era, in the 20th year of his reign, Piye marched north. What he found was an Egypt fractured into a dozen competing principalities, ruled by local strongmen who gave themselves pharaonic titles but shared neither Pi's ambition nor his religious conviction. The Prince of Sais, Tefnacht, was the most powerful of these local rulers, and he was expanding aggressively, absorbing principality after principality. Piye's inscription records the moment he received word of this expansion with something that reads like barely controlled fury. He mobilized his army, sent it north by river, and followed it himself. When his forces took the city of Hermopolis, the stele records Piye's reaction to its captured horses, horses that had been allowed to starve during the siege. He was more outraged about the horses than about anything else. It is one of those genuinely human moments that leaps across 3,000 years and makes the past suddenly vivid. This was not a military machine. This was a king. PA took Memphis. He took city after city. He received the submission of local rulers who knelt before him at his riverboat, bringing gifts. And then, in an act that tells you everything about this man's character, he purified himself, offered to Amun, and entered the great temple of Ptah at Memphis to pray. He had just conquered the most famous civilization on earth. His first act was not triumph, it was worship. Having received the full submission of Egypt, PA did something unexpected. He returned to Napata. He would never go back to Egypt. He had proved what he came to prove, that the servants of Amun in the south were the true heirs of Egypt's divine order. His successors would go further. They would stay, and under one of them, a king named Taharka, the Kushite empire would reach a scale and a grandeur that has never been fully acknowledged in the history books. Let us begin at the beginning. Not in Egypt, but in what is today northern Sudan, and a landscape that does not look at first glance like the cradle of a great civilization. The Sahara presses in from the west and east. The desert is merciless. But running through this desiccation like a vein of life is the Nile, and along its banks the soil is dark, rich, and startlingly fertile. The people who settled here in the fourth millennium before the Common Era were not Egyptians, though they were their neighbors. They were Africans with their own languages, their own traditions, their own ways of organizing the world. They herded cattle, they traded, they buried their dead with care and ritual, and they watched the great civilization to the north with curious, calculating eyes. Let us begin at the beginning. Not in Egypt, but in what is today northern Sudan, and a landscape that does not look at first glance like the cradle of a great civilization. The Sahara presses in from the west and east. The desert is merciless. But running through this desiccation like a vein of life is the Nile, and along its banks the soil is dark, rich, and startlingly fertile. The people who settled here in the fourth millennium before the Common Era were not Egyptians, though they were their neighbors. They were Africans with their own languages, their own traditions, their own ways of organizing the world. They herded cattle, they traded, they buried their dead with care and ritual, and they watched the great civilization to the north with curious, calculating eyes. The Kerma culture, named for the city at its heart, is the first confirmed African kingdom south of Egypt, and it is extraordinary. At its height, between approximately 1,700 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, the Kingdom of Kerma controlled the Nile Valley between the Second and Fourth Cataracts, a territory as large as Egypt itself. The city of Kerma was a true metropolis. Excavations led by Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet beginning in the 1970s revealed a planned urban center with a central ceremonial zone, residential neighborhoods, craftsmen's quarters, and at the heart of it all, the Western Defufa, a massive mud brick structure 18 meters tall used for religious ceremony. Alongside it, an Eastern Defufa used as a funerary chapel. These are among the largest mud brick structures anywhere in the ancient world, and they stand in Sudan today, largely unknown to most visitors who make the pilgrimage to Egypt instead. The cemetery at Kerma is one of the most revealing archaeological sites in Africa. It contains more than 30,000 graves, a number that speaks to centuries of continuous occupation and to a society with complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. The royal burial mounds, the tumuli, are among the most imposing funerary monuments in the ancient world outside of Egypt. The largest measure 90 meters in diameter. Within them, the kings of Kerma were laid to rest on elaborate beds decorated with gold and ivory, surrounded by their possessions, fine pottery, weapons, jewelry, and around them, positioned in specific orientations, the bodies of those who died with them. In the burial mound of one ruler, archaeologists found the remains of approximately 400 individuals, and men, women, and children who were killed at the moment of the royal funeral. The scale of this ritual sacrifice tells us something about the absolute power of Kerma's kings, power that would in time transform into something far more enduring. The relationship between Kerma and Egypt was never simple. In the centuries around 2,000 years before the Common Era, during Egypt's Middle Kingdom, the two powers were engaged in a complex dance of trade, diplomacy, and occasional warfare. Egypt built a chain of massive mud brick fortresses between the first and second cataracts, fortifications whose ruins still stand at sites like Buin and Semna, explicitly to control the flow of trade goods from the south and to keep Kerma's armies at bay. Egyptian texts from this period describe the Nubians with a mixture of admiration and contempt that tells us the Egyptians were simultaneously attracted to the wealth of Kush and deeply unsettled by the power of its kings. The execration texts, magical rituals in which Egypt's enemies were cursed, name Nubian rulers specifically, casting them in clay figurines and ritually smashing them. You do not waste the effort of a curse on someone who doesn't frighten you. Around 1,650 years before the Common Era, Egypt suffered one of its greatest humiliations. A foreign people, the Hyksos, invaded from the northeast and seized control of the Delta and Lower Egypt. The native Egyptian pharaohs of the 17th dynasty were pushed back to Thebes, sandwiched between the Hyksos to the north and Kerma to the south. And here is a detail of extraordinary historical resonance. The Hyksos and the kingdom of Kerma corresponded with each other. They exchanged letters, some of which survive, discussing the possibility of coordinating attacks on Egypt from both ends simultaneously. The plan, if it ever truly existed, never materialized. The Egyptian pharaoh Ahmose managed to expel the Hyksos and reunify Egypt, but the memory of this near catastrophe, being caught between two enemies, colored Egypt's relationship with Kush for the next 4 centuries. The revenge, when it came, was total. Pharaoh Thutmose I, and one of the most aggressive military rulers in Egyptian history, led his army deep into Nubia around 1,500 years before the Common Era. He penetrated beyond the Fourth Cataract, further south than any Egyptian pharaoh had gone before, and left an inscription at Tombos that read, in effect, "I have brought the southern boundary of Egypt to where the sun rises." His successors continued the conquest. Thutmose III, perhaps the greatest military pharaoh Egypt ever produced, completed the subjugation. Kerma was destroyed. The Defufa was stripped of its religious function. The kingdom of Kerma ceased to exist. Egypt appointed a viceroy of Kush, one of the most powerful administrative positions in the Egyptian state, and turned Nubia into a province. What had been a rival kingdom became a source of tribute. For the next 400 years, Kush would be a colony. 4 centuries of Egyptian rule, 400 years. What happened during those centuries is one of the most fascinating processes in the ancient world. A colonized people so thoroughly absorbed the culture of the colonizer that they eventually became its most ardent defenders and, in the end, its rulers. The Nubian elite was transformed. They adopted Egyptian names, they wore Egyptian dress, they buried their dead under Egyptian-style pyramid tombs. Miniature pyramids, yes, but pyramids nonetheless, appearing in Nubian cemeteries centuries before the great Kushite building program. They worshipped Egyptian gods, above all, Amun, the king of the gods. Egyptian and Nubian artistic styles began to blend in ways that are sometimes difficult to disentangle. But beneath the surface, beneath the Egyptian veneer, the Nubian masses retained their own languages, their own customs, their own deep sense of identity. The people of Kush were not becoming Egyptian. They were learning to speak Egyptian and waiting for the day when they would speak it back louder than the Egyptians ever had. The opportunity came when Egypt began to fall apart. The new kingdom, which had reached its apex under Ramesses II in the 13th century before the Common Era, began a long, grinding decline. The sea peoples invaded from the Mediterranean. Administrative corruption hollowed out the state. the power of the priests of Amun at Karnak grew to rival the pharaoh himself. By 1069 years before the Common Era, Egypt had fractured into its third intermediate period, a time of political division and weakness that would last for 4 centuries. In the south, in Nubia, the Kushite kingdom was quietly reconstituting itself. Free from Egyptian governors, a new ruling class emerged at Napata, the city just downstream from Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain where Amun himself was said to dwell. These new rulers embraced the Amun cult not as a foreign import, but as their own divine inheritance, and they began to build. The great Amun temple at Jebel Barkal, originally built by Egyptian pharaohs but now claimed and expanded by the Kushite kings, became the religious heart of the new Kushite state. The Kushite rulers saw themselves as the rightful successors to Egypt's divine order. When Egypt's priests and princes squabbled, when the great civilization fell into confusion and infighting, it was the Nubians at Napata who maintained the purity of Amun's cult. This was not a peripheral claim. It was a direct challenge to every petty ruler in Egypt who called himself pharaoh. The Kushites were not imitating Egypt. They were, in their own eyes, protecting it. And they had the military power to act on that conviction. Around 750 years before the Common Era, the first great Kushite king began to move. Kashta was the king who first claimed dominion over Upper Egypt, the first Kushite ruler to use full Egyptian pharaonic titles. His sister or daughter, the divine adoratrice of Amun at Karnak, gave the Kushites a foothold in Egypt's most powerful religious institution. But it was his son, Pi, also called Pianki, who transformed political influence into outright conquest. Pi ruled Kush from approximately 747 to 714 years before the Common Era. In the 20th year of his reign, around 727 before the Common Era, he launched his campaign northward. The pretext was the expansion of Tefnacht, the ambitious prince of Sais in the western delta, who was absorbing principality after principality. P.A.'s Stele describes him receiving this news with righteous fury. Tefnacht was violating the order of Amun. P.A. would restore it. P.A.'s military campaign northward was methodical and overwhelming. His forces, seasoned by years of warfare in Nubia, moved up the Nile with a strategic brilliance that left Egypt's fragmented princes no real chance to organize a coherent defense. City after city fell: Thebes, Heracleopolis, Hermopolis. The victory stele records one remarkable moment at Hermopolis. When Paye entered the city after its surrender, he found the royal stables. The horses had been left to starve during the siege. Paye's inscription records his reaction with genuine outrage, not at the human suffering, but at the treatment of the horses. He loved horses. The stele explicitly states, His Majesty proceeded to the stable of the horses in the quarters of the foals. When he saw them, he was more troubled than anything he saw in the country. He said that by his own life it is more painful to my heart that my horses suffered hunger than any other ill that you did to me in your wickedness. This detail has survived 3,000 years. It is a window into a man. Memphis fell. The city that had been the capital of Egypt since the very first dynasties, the city of the god Ptah, the city that symbolized the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. It surrendered to a Nubian king. Pa then sailed north to Heliopolis, the city of the sun god Ra, and from there to the Delta, where one by one the petty kings and princes came to his boat to offer submission. The stele records their arrival. Some entered the water, others bowed on the shore, prostrating themselves with obeisance. Pa received them all. He was magnanimous in victory, and the quality that the stele presents as evidence of his divine nature, his connection to Amun, his righteousness. But then he did something that puzzled his contemporaries and puzzles historians today. He returned to Napata. Having conquered Egypt, Pa went home. He would never return. He ruled the greatest empire in the ancient world from his capital in Nubia for the rest of his long reign, and when he died, he was buried under a pyramid at El Kuru, in the Nubian tradition. Pa's successors stayed. His brother Shabaka took the throne around 705 years before the Common Era and transferred the dynasty's seat of power to Memphis itself, making the Kushite kingdom officially the 25th dynasty of Egypt. Shabaka was deeply devoted to restoring Egypt's ancient traditions. He ordered the copying of ancient religious texts, including the Memphite theology, a text of enormous theological significance, onto stone, fearing that the papyrus originals would decay. He restored temples he built. Under Shabaka, the Kushite rulers embraced Egyptian culture with a reverence that exceeded that of many Egyptian rulers themselves. The Kushites did not come to destroy Egypt's traditions. They came in their own self-conception to save them. And for a generation it worked. Egypt under the 25th dynasty experienced something of a renaissance, temple construction, artistic flourishing, religious renewal. Then came Taharqa. Of all the Kushite pharaohs, Taharqa is the most remarkable, the most documented, and in many ways the most tragic figure. He came to the throne in 690 years before the Common Era, and he would rule for 26 years, the longest reign of any 25th dynasty pharaoh. Under Taharqa, the Kushite Empire reached its greatest geographical extent and its highest cultural achievement. He built across the entire length of the Nile Valley, from Khartoum to the Delta, temples, monuments, additions to existing shrines. At Karnak, the greatest religious complex in the ancient world, he erected a colonnade of enormous pillars. At Jebel Barkal, he expanded the Amun temple. At Nuri, he built what would become the largest pyramid in the Nubian tradition, a monument that still stands today, 52 meters at the base. He was connected to the world beyond Egypt as well. The Hebrew Bible mentions him by name in the second book of Kings in connection with Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. Taharqa's reign also brought the Kushite Empire into direct collision with the rising superpower of the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, based in what is today northern Iraq, was the most fearsome military machine the ancient Near East had ever produced. Its armies used iron weapons and sophisticated siege techniques. Its rulers, men like Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon, were implacably expansionist, absorbing kingdom after kingdom. Egypt under Taharqa became deeply involved in the politics of the Levant, the narrow coastal corridor that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia. Taharqa sent aid to the kings of Judah and other small Levantine states who resisted Assyrian domination. The Assyrian kings tolerated this interference for years, but their patience had limits. In 674 years before the Common Era, Esarhaddon, the Assyrian king, launched his first invasion of Egypt. Remarkably, he failed. Babylonian records confirm that Taharqa defeated the Assyrian forces in that first engagement, one of the very few times any power successfully repelled an Assyrian army in the field. It was a moment of genuine triumph for Kush, but 3 years later, in 671 years before the Common Era, Esarhaddon came back with his full army. This time, he did not fail. The Assyrians pushed through the Sinai Peninsula, defeated the Kushite forces in multiple battles, and took Memphis. Taharqa barely escaped, with his life fleeing south toward Nubia. Esarhaddon installed Egyptian princes as subject rulers, took Taharqa's son and queen as hostages, and returned to Assyria, having accomplished something no foreign power had ever managed: the military conquest of Egypt. But Taharqa was not finished. Twice more he returned from the south, rallying support, driving the Assyrian-appointed rulers out of Upper Egypt, reclaiming Memphis. Twice more the Assyrians drove him back. He died in Napata in 664 years before the Common Era, never having fully reclaimed what he had lost, but never having entirely surrendered either. He was succeeded by his nephew Tanutamun, who launched one final extraordinary attempt to reclaim Egypt. Tanutamun had a dream and recorded in what is called the Dream Stele, in which two serpents coiled around him, one on each side, representing Upper and Lower Egypt. He took it as a divine sign. He marched north, killed Necho of Sais, the Egyptian prince the Assyrians had installed, and briefly retook Memphis. For a few months, it looked as though the 25th dynasty might survive after all. Then Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, responded. In 663 years before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal's Assyrian army entered Egypt and marched straight for Thebes, the city that had been Egypt's religious capital for 1,000 years, the city of 100 gates, the city the ancient Greeks would call the most magnificent they had ever seen. The Assyrians sacked it completely, systematically. They carried away the obelisks, the gold, the silver, the sacred images. The sack of Thebes sent shockwaves through the ancient world. The prophet Nahum, writing about it in the Hebrew Bible, used it as a warning about what happens to great powers when they fall. A city even greater than Nineveh, he wrote, had fallen. Thebes never fully recovered. Tutankhamun fled south back to Nubia and never returned to Egypt. The 25th dynasty was over after approximately 90 years of Kushite rule over all Egypt. The Nubians had been pushed back across the First Cataract. The era of the Black Pharaohs had ended. And yet, the kingdom of Kush did not collapse. It did not disintegrate. It retreated southward back to its homeland, and there it did something unexpected. It flourished, free from the obligation of ruling Egypt, free from the exhausting wars with Assyria. The Kushite kingdom entered a new phase. The capital moved eventually to a city much further south, Meroe. And Meroe would become one of the most remarkable cities in the ancient world, a capital of iron, of pyramids, of warrior queens, and of a writing system that still holds its secrets. The era we call the Meroitic period lasted from approximately 270 years before the Common Era to 350 years of the Common Era, more than 6 centuries of independent civilization. This is the chapter of Kushite history that most people have never heard of, and it is astonishing. Why Meroe? The city sat approximately 200 kilometers northeast of modern Khartoum, on the eastern bank of the Nile. Its location was strategic for several reasons. It sat at the boundary of the summer rainfall belt, meaning it received more rain than Napata to the north and could support more agriculture. More importantly, the land around Meroe was rich in two things that would define its economy for centuries: iron ore and hardwood. Specifically, the acacia forest needed to fuel the blast furnaces that turned iron ore into iron. Meroe became the iron-working capital of sub-Saharan Africa. The slag heaps, the waste products of iron smelting that archaeologists have found, they are so extensive that one 19th century scholar famously called Meroe the Birmingham of Africa. That phrase is now considered an oversimplification. Meroe was far more than an industrial city, but it captures something real about the city's economic identity. The trade network that Meroe anchored was vast. Iron tools and weapons moved out from the city in all directions. From the African interior came ivory, exotic animal skins, ostrich feathers, ebony, and enslaved people. From the north came the demand of the Mediterranean world, Egypt, Greece, Rome, hungry for the products of tropical Africa. Meroe sat at the intersection of these networks, enriching itself as the intermediary between worlds. Cotton was grown in the Meroitic heartland and woven into textiles. Gold still flowed from the Nubian mines that had enriched Egypt for centuries. The result was a city of considerable wealth and sophistication, with palace complexes, temples, bathhouses, and a distinctive artistic style that blended pharaonic Egyptian forms with uniquely Kushite elements. The Apetamak lion god, the warrior queens in full armor, the elephants that appear in Meroitic art with a frequency that suggests they were both symbols of royal power and practical participants in the economy. One of the most striking features of Meroitic civilization is what happened to its writing. For centuries, the Kushite kingdom had used Egyptian hieroglyphics, the script of the people who had once conquered them. But around 180 years before the Common Era, the kingdom began to develop its own alphabetic script, Meroitic. It was revolutionary. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, a system of hundreds of signs that represented words and syllables in highly complex combinations, Meroitic was an alphabet of just 23 characters. It could, in theory, be learned in weeks rather than years. It was used for administrative documents, religious inscriptions, and funerary texts. It was carved onto the walls of temples, written in ink on papyrus, stamped onto pottery. And then, here is the remarkable thing, we still cannot fully read it. Scholars can sound out Meroitic words. The alphabet was deciphered in 1911 by Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith. But because we have no bilingual text comparable to the Rosetta Stone, we cannot understand most of what the words mean. The language of an entire civilization remains locked away from us. Think about what that means. We have thousands of Meroitic inscriptions. We know how they sound. We can reproduce the phonetics, but the vocabulary and the grammar, the stories these texts tell, are still largely beyond us. We do not know what Kushite history looks like from the inside. We do not know how the Meroites described their own defeats or celebrated their own victories in their own words, in their own language. We know the bare outlines of their chronology from external sources in Egyptian, Greek, Roman, but the interior life of the civilization, the way it understood itself, remains sealed behind a script that awaits its Rosetta Stone. Dozens of scholars today are working on the Meroitic language problem, applying computational linguistics and comparative analysis. Small progress has been made. Some words have tentative translations, but the great body of Meroitic literature, if such a thing existed, remains inaccessible. It is one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. The Meroitic religion tells us something important about what happened when Kush stepped out of Egypt's shadow. For centuries, the dominant god was Amun, Egypt's king of the gods, whose great temple at Jebel Barkal remained a central pillar of Kushite kingship. But at Meroe, a new deity rose to prominence alongside Amun, Apetamach, the lion god, a deity entirely Nubian in origin, with no Egyptian equivalent, whose earliest known image appears at the lion temple of Musawarat es-Sufra, a remarkable site in the desert south of Meroe, built in the late 3rd century before the Common Era. Apetamach is depicted in extraordinary ways, as a man with a lion's head carrying bow and arrow, as a 3-headed lion man with 4 arms, as a cobra with a lion's head. He was a war god, a god of conquest and military victory, and the Meroitic kings invoked him before battle. Apetamach's rise symbolizes something profound. The Meroitic kingdom was defining itself on its own terms, no longer in Egyptian categories. And then there are the pyramids. If there is one fact about the kingdom of Kush that, once heard, is impossible to forget, it is this: Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. More. Not fewer, not comparable, more. There are over 200 pyramids at and around the site of Meroe, and when you add the pyramid fields at Napata, at Nuri, at El Kuru, at Jebel Barkal, the total number of Kushite pyramids approaches 250 or more. Egypt, for all its fame, has about 130. The Kushite pyramids are different in form from their Egyptian predecessors. They are steeper. Their faces rise at an angle of 65 to 70 degrees compared to the Egyptian 45 to 50 degrees. They are smaller in footprint, typically between 6 and 30 meters tall. They have distinctive small offering chapels attached to their eastern faces, often decorated with carved reliefs of the ruler being escorted to the afterlife by Anubis or Isis. They are not Egyptian pyramids. They are Kushite pyramids, a distinctly Nubian form of an idea they borrowed and made entirely their own. Walking through the pyramid field at Meroe today, if you are one of the relatively few visitors who make the journey to northern Sudan, is a disorienting experience. You are surrounded by monuments of comparable ambition to those in Egypt, but with almost no one else there, no queues, no fences keeping you back, You can walk up to the offering chapels and touch the carved reliefs of the queens and kings who lie within. You can stand in the doorway of a pyramid built 2,000 years ago and look directly into the offering chamber. The intimacy of it is remarkable, and it only deepens the strangeness of Kush's relative invisibility. These structures should be as famous as Giza. The fact that they are not, and the fact that most people who can name 5 Egyptian pharaohs cannot name a single Kushite ruler, is itself a historical artifact, a product of choices about which civilizations get to be at the center of the story. Among those buried in the pyramids of Meroe are the Kandakes, the warrior queens of Kush. This is one of the most extraordinary aspects of Meroitic civilization, the role of women in power. The word Kandake, anglicized to Candace, in many historical sources from a Meroitic title meaning queen mother or ruling queen, denotes a category of female ruler unique in the ancient world. These were not regents acting on behalf of minor kings. They were not consorts given ceremonial titles. They were ruling queens, women who commanded armies, directed diplomacy, and were buried in the same pyramid tombs as their male counterparts. The Meroitic artistic tradition depicts them accordingly: large, powerful, full-figured women in warrior armor leading soldiers into battle, smiting enemies, receiving tribute from subject peoples. The imagery is explicit about their authority. In a world where female rulers were exceptional, where even Cleopatra was depicted on temple walls as male to fit the conventions of pharaonic tradition, the Kandakes of Kush were strikingly confidently themselves. The most famous of the Kandakes is Amanirenas, who ruled approximately from 40 to 10 years before the Common Era. Her story is one of the great overlooked epics of the ancient world, and it involves a confrontation with the most powerful empire on earth, Rome. In the year 27 before the Common Era, Octavian, now renamed Augustus, completed his conquest of Egypt and made it a Roman province. For Kush, this was alarming. Their northern neighbor was now controlled by an empire of unprecedented military power, and Rome immediately began extracting tribute from the border regions of Nubia. Amanirenas responded as a ruler who was not remotely intimidated. The year was 25 before the Common Era. While the Roman prefect of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, was away on an expedition into Arabia, she struck. Amanirenas' army swept north and attacked the Roman-held cities of southern Egypt. They took Syene, modern Aswan. They took Elephantine. They took Philae. They destroyed Roman statues, enslaved Roman citizens, and carried off images of Augustus. Among the trophies they brought back to Kush was the bronze head of a statue of Augustus Caesar, severed from its body. Back at Meroe, this head was buried beneath the threshold of a victory temple, specifically placed so that every person who entered the temple would step over Augustus's face. It was a calculated humiliation, an act of profound symbolic power. That bronze head was excavated in 1910 by British archaeologist John Garstang and is now in the British Museum in London. It is one of the finest bronze portraits of Augustus to have survived from antiquity, and it was preserved precisely because it was buried under a Nubian queen's temple floor. Rome responded. The new prefect, Gaius Petronius, marched south with approximately 10,000 infantry and 800 cavalry. The ancient Greek historian Strabo, who had access to Petronius's account, describes the Kushite forces as numbering around 30,000. He also describes something telling about Amanirenas herself. She was, he wrote, a masculine sort of woman and blind in one eye. That she was blind in one eye is one of those specific, verifiable, seeming details that lodges in the imagination. How did she lose it? In battle? From illness? We do not know, but Strabo is matter of fact about it, which suggests it was a known fact at the time. The Roman force was more professionally equipped. Petronius pushed the Kushites back, captured the fortress city of Napata, and extracted significant plunder. But he did not destroy Kush. He could not hold it. His supply lines were too long, the terrain too difficult, the Kushite resistance too determined. A stalemate emerged. The war lasted 3 years, day, from approximately 25 to 22 years before the Common Era. It ended not in Roman victory, but in negotiation. Amanirenas sent ambassadors to Augustus, who was then on the island of Samos. The treaty they negotiated is remarkable. Kush was exempted from paying tribute to Rome. The Roman frontier was moved north to Hiera Sycaminos, a point considerably south of the First Cataract. The Kushites got better terms than virtually any people who ever went to war with Rome and lost militarily. The reason is strategic. Rome calculated that the cost of subduing Kush, the heat, the terrain, the logistics, the sheer difficulty of fighting in Nubian desert, was not worth the potential benefit. Kush could exist as a buffer state on Rome's southern border. The treaty held for nearly 300 years. Augustus never marched south again, and the bronze head of his statue remained buried under Amanirenas' temple floor, at the foot of the staircase she climbed every day. The Meroitic period after Amanirenas saw continued vitality, new temples, new pyramids, new trade connections. The kingdom maintained relations with Rome not as a subject, but as a recognized neighbor. Roman goods flowed into Kush. Kushite goods flowed into Rome. Glass vessels made in Roman workshops have been found in Kushite tombs. Meroitic pottery has been found at Roman sites on the Egyptian border. The exchange was real, commercial, and continuous. Other Kandakes ruled in the centuries after Amanirenas, though their identities and stories are harder to reconstruct. A Kandake named Amanitore is known from a major temple at Naka, the great Meroitic site in the Bhutana steppe, where she and a king named Natakamani are depicted in vivid carved relief, making offerings and smiting enemies with the full iconographic vocabulary of pharaonic tradition. This was not a civilization in decline, not yet, but the signs of strain appeared, as they always do in history, long before the actual collapse. The first and perhaps most fundamental pressure on Meroe was environmental. The iron industry that gave the city its wealth was also slowly destroying the ecosystem that sustained it. The blast furnaces required enormous quantities of charcoal. Charcoal required enormous quantities of wood. The acacia forests that had surrounded Meroe were being consumed faster than they could regenerate. The slag heaps, the mountains of iron smelting waste that still dominate the Meroitic landscape, are mute testimony to the scale of this industrial activity. And as the forests diminished, the land around them became more vulnerable to desertification. Rainfall patterns may have shifted. Overgrazing by cattle, which were central to the Meroitic economy, may have accelerated soil degradation. The fields that had fed the city were gradually becoming less productive. The economic pressure was compounded by changes in the wider world. The trade networks that had enriched Meroe were shifting. In the first and second centuries of the Common Era, Rome was at its height, and the demand for Kushite luxury goods remained strong. But the third century brought crisis to the Roman Empire: political instability, economic contraction, currency debasement. Rome's ability to purchase Kushite goods declined. Simultaneously, a new power was rising on the Red Sea coast that would prove fatal to Kush's role as the intermediary between Africa and the Mediterranean. That power was Aksum. Based in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, Aksum had direct access to the Red Sea and, through it, to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. As Aksum grew, it began to divert the trade that had previously flowed through Kush. Ivory, gold, and exotic goods that had once passed through Meroe could now bypass it entirely, sailing directly from Aksumite Red Sea ports to Alexandria and beyond. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, Meroe was weakening. The pyramid building program, that long, continuous line of royal monuments that stretched back to the Napatan period, was slowing. The quality of construction was declining. The palaces were less grand, the trade goods were less abundant, the city was not dying yet, but it was contracting, turning inward, losing its place at the center of the world's commercial networks. And then, in approximately 330 years of the Common Era, the sources are frustratingly imprecise, the Aksumite king Izana launched a military campaign into the Kushite heartland. This is where the historical record becomes contested, and where we must be honest about what we know and what we do not. The primary source for this campaign is Izana's own inscriptions, and rulers do not tend to write objective accounts of their military actions. What seems clear is that Izana's forces reached Meroe and destroyed it. The Axumites called themselves conquerors, but some scholars argue that Meroe may have been largely abandoned already, a dying city that Izana's army finished off rather than destroyed at its height. The debate about how exactly Kush ended is genuine and ongoing among scholars. The Axumite invasion theory that King Izana of Axum militarily conquered Meroe around 330 to 350 years of the Common Era is supported by Izana's own inscriptions, which describe a campaign against a people called the Noba and the Kasu. But other scholars point to archaeological evidence suggesting that Meroe was in serious decline for decades before any Aksumite intervention, that the population was already shrinking, the iron industry already contracting, the trade networks already rerouting away from the city. The truth is almost certainly a combination. A kingdom weakened by environmental degradation, economic disruption, and possibly internal political fragmentation, which an opportunistic Aksumite king delivered the final blow to. The last dated Meroitic inscription that archaeologists can confidently date is from around the mid-4th century. After that, silence. The pyramid building stops. The Meroitic script stops appearing on new monuments. The great civilization fades. Around 350 years of the Common Era, give or take a decade that the historical record cannot fully resolve, the kingdom of Kush ceased to exist as a political entity. After nearly 3,000 years of continuous civilization in the Nile Valley south of Egypt, from the Kerma culture of 2,500 years before the Common Era to the Meroitic kingdom of the 4th century. The story of Kush was over, or rather, it was over as a kingdom. The people did not vanish. The Nubian language did not vanish. The culture did not vanish. Nubian successor states, the kingdoms of Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia, rose in the centuries after Meroe's fall and maintained a distinct Nubian cultural identity for centuries more. One of them would convert to Christianity in the 6th century and produce an extraordinary Christian Nubian civilization that endured into the 14th century. But the political entity that we call Kush, the kingdom that had ruled Egypt, that had built the pyramids at Meroe, that had held off Rome, was gone. So how did a kingdom of this magnitude occur? A kingdom that ruled Egypt, that built more pyramids than the Egyptians, that negotiated as an equal with Rome, disappear so completely from the popular imagination? The forgetting was not an accident, it was a process, and it had several causes. The first is geographical. Kush's heartland, and what is now northern Sudan, is not an easy place to visit or to excavate. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, European Egyptology concentrated its resources on Egypt, which was more accessible, better documented in classical sources, and frankly, more legible to European scholars who had grown up reading the Greek and Roman accounts that emphasized Egypt's primacy. Sudan was peripheral in every sense. The second cause of the forgetting is the undeciphered Meroitic script. Egypt has been legible to modern scholars since the decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822. The Rosetta Stone gave scholars the key to unlock 3,000 years of Egyptian self-documentation. Kush has no such key. Its own records and the inscriptions on its temple walls, its administrative texts, its religious documents remain largely opaque. We are forced to understand Kush almost entirely through the eyes of others. Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and those others consistently placed Kush at the margins. The Greeks and Romans knew of the Kushites. Herodotus wrote about them, calling them the Ethiopians of the Nile and describing them in ways that combined accurate observation with mythological exaggeration. but they were always the exotic periphery. Egypt was the center. And so Egypt got the scholarship and Kush got the footnotes. The third cause is more uncomfortable to discuss, but it must be discussed honestly. The history of Egyptology and classical scholarship was shaped by scholars who, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously, found it easier to recognize the achievements of ancient Egypt, which had deeply influenced Greece and Rome and through them the entire Western tradition, than to acknowledge the achievements of a black African kingdom that had come to dominate that same Egypt. The Kushite pharaohs, dark-skinned Nubian kings who wore the double crown and built pyramids and whose faces survive in statues of extraordinary power and beauty, have been systematically underrepresented in the popular understanding of ancient history. A 2001 National Geographic article called The Kushite Rulers, the Black Pharaohs, and it had the quality of a revelation for many readers. Not because the information was new to scholars, it had been known for over a century, but because it had not filtered into the popular consciousness. The pyramids of Meroe are not on the tourist trail. The name Taharka is not on the tip of every educated tongue, and this asymmetry is itself a form of historical distortion. But the tide is turning. In the past 3 decades, archaeological work in Sudan has intensified dramatically. The site of Kerma has been extensively excavated, revealing a civilization of startling sophistication that predates the Kushite kingdom by centuries. The pyramids at Meroe are the subject of ongoing research by teams from universities in Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Sudan itself. The Sudan National Museum in Khartoum houses an extraordinary collection of Meroitic objects that rivals the Egyptian collections of the world's great museums. The effort to decipher the Meroitic language is intensifying, with computational linguists bringing new tools to bear on the problem. The kingdom of Kush is being reclaimed, and not just by archaeologists, but by Sudanese scholars and the Sudanese public, who recognize in this history a heritage of extraordinary pride. Let us return now to the beginning, to the cold, open question: how does a kingdom of this magnitude get forgotten? We have explored the answers: geography, language, the bias of scholarship, the gravitational pull of Egypt, which absorbed the attention of every civilization that encountered it, and in doing so pulled the spotlight away from the remarkable kingdom to its south. But there is one more answer, and it is the most poignant. Kush was forgotten because it was too close to Egypt, because it borrowed Egypt's gods and Egypt's script and Egypt's architectural forms. The casual observer could look at it and see only an imitation, a pale copy, a province. The reality was the opposite. Kush was not imitating Egypt. It was engaging with Egypt, absorbing what was useful, transforming it, adding its own genius, and producing something entirely distinct. The same process by which Renaissance Europe engaged with ancient Rome, the same process by which Japan engaged with Tang Dynasty China. Influence is not imitation, and Kush was never a copy of anything. Consider what the kingdom of Kush actually achieved, laid out in sequence. Between 2,500 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, the Kerma culture built one of the first urban civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa, independently without Egyptian assistance. Between 750 and 656 years before the Common Era, the Kushite kings of the 25th dynasty conquered and ruled Egypt, the largest and most sophisticated empire of the ancient world, becoming its pharaohs and presiding over a cultural renaissance. They were mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. They defeated an Assyrian invasion in 674 before the Common Era, one of the very few times any power stopped an Assyrian army in the field. They built pyramids across the entire Nile Valley, leaving behind more pyramid monuments than Egypt itself. Their language, Meroitic, was written in a unique alphabet developed independently of any other African writing system south of Egypt. Their warrior queens negotiated as equals with the Roman Empire, and they maintained a continuous identifiable civilization for approximately 3,000 years, from the Kerma culture to the fall of Meroe. 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, 3,000 years ago from today is roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era. That was the era of King David in the Hebrew tradition, of the Trojan War in Greek tradition, of the late Bronze Age collapse. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, originating in what is today one of the most politically troubled and economically impoverished regions on earth, northern Sudan, and producing achievements that by any objective measure rank with the greatest accomplishments of the ancient world. The forgetting of Kush is not just a historical oversight, it is an active choice, repeated generation after generation, to place certain civilizations at the center of the story of human achievement and others at the margins. Every time we tell the story of ancient Egypt without mentioning that for a century it was ruled by Nubian pharaohs, we are making that choice again. But the most remarkable thing about the kingdom of Kush is not what it achieved in the past, it is what it still holds. The Meroitic script remains largely undeciphered. Somewhere in those thousands of inscriptions on temple walls and offering chapels and stone stelae, somewhere in the text carved by Meroitic scribes on objects we have not yet found, there may be a Kush that is entirely different from the Kush we can currently describe. There may be court records and love poems and histories and religious meditations. There may be Amanirena's own account of her war with Rome. There may be a Kushite understanding of why their kingdom fell, told in their own words, in their own language, waiting for the scholar who finally finds the key. The civilization is not only in the past, it is still partially sealed, a civilization that has not yet fully given up its secrets. The pyramids of Meroe stand in the desert today, slightly damaged, one of them catastrophically so, because in the 1830s an Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini blew off the tops of 40 of them with explosives searching for gold. He found some. He destroyed irreplaceable monuments in the process. Some of what he found is now in museums in Berlin and Munich. The pyramids he damaged stand with their tops shorn off, looking like truncated teeth, a visual testament to the way in which Kushite heritage has been treated for centuries, as raw material to be mined rather than as a living inheritance to be protected, but they still stand. 2,000 years after the last Meroitic king was buried beneath one of them, they still stand. Steep and narrow and golden in the desert light, they are among the most beautiful monuments I know of anywhere on earth, and they are, for the moment, nearly all yours when you visit. That will change. The world is beginning to remember. The UNESCO World Heritage List includes the sites of Meroe, Napata, and Kerma. The Sudanese government, despite enormous political and economic pressures, has maintained the pyramids as a site of national pride. Archaeologists from across the world continue to dig, to analyze, to photograph, to preserve. There is a growing tourism infrastructure, that modest but real, that is beginning to bring visitors to what was once among the most overlooked archaeological landscapes on Earth. And in universities and research institutes, the effort to unlock the Meroitic language is ongoing, patient, determined. One day, perhaps in the lifetime of someone watching this video, the Rosetta Stone of Meroe will be found. Perhaps it already exists somewhere in an unexcavated temple, waiting. And when it is found, and when scholars finally read the words of the Kushites in the Kushites' own language, the story of this forgotten kingdom will be told again, completely, finally, in the voice it always deserved. Until that day, let us hold what we know. Let us remember Paye, the Nubian king who conquered Egypt and then prayed in its temples before going home, who was more outraged by the mistreatment of horses than by the acts of war done against him. Let us remember Taharka, the black pharaoh who built the largest pyramid in Nubian history, who presided over a cultural renaissance, who fought the Assyrian war machine and lost, but did not break. Let us remember Amanirenas, the one-eyed warrior queen who marched against Rome, cut off the head of Augustus's statue, buried it beneath her temple steps, and then negotiated a peace that gave her kingdom 3 more centuries of independence. Let us remember the thousands of scribes and iron workers and weavers and farmers and priests who built and sustained this civilization for 3,000 years. And let us remember that the story of the ancient world is not a story about one place or one people. It is a story about all of us, all of the civilizations, all of the languages, all of the gods, all of the dreams of the countless generations who came before. The kingdom of Kush is not a footnote to Egypt's story. It is a story in its own right, one of the great civilizational narratives of the ancient world, with its own arc of rise and brilliance and fall, its own cast of extraordinary human beings, its own still unsolved mysteries. The fact that it has been forgotten, the fact that most people watching this video are learning about it for the first time, or in far greater depth than they ever had before, is not a reflection of Kush's importance. It is a reflection of our own blind spots. History is not simply what happened, it is what we choose to remember. The desert of northern Sudan is full of pyramids. It is full of carved inscriptions. It is full of the residue of a civilization that changed the world. The sand covers them, but it does not erase them. All we have to do is look. That is the story of the kingdom of Kush. But every great story, when it ends, opens a door into another, because Kush did not disappear in isolation. The world it left behind, the Nile Valley, the trading networks of Africa, the spaces between the old empires, was immediately filled by new powers. And the most remarkable of those new powers was the one that delivered Kush its final blow, the kingdom of Aksum. Aksum was not merely a regional power that replaced Kush on the map. It was a civilization of extraordinary originality, the first African state to mint its own coins, one of the first kingdoms in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion, a naval power that extended its reach to Arabia and India, and a builder of the most singular monuments in the ancient world, the great carved obelisks of Axum, some of the tallest carved structures ever erected by hand that still stand today in northern Ethiopia. The story of how a highland Ethiopian kingdom became one of the great empires of the late ancient world, how it absorbed the legacy of Kush, reached across the Red Sea, and defined the fate of the Horn of Africa for 1,000 years. That is the story we tell next. We will see you there.